Here's the marked up book copy you were you were mentioning. Actually, we picked this up after hearing that we would be on a panel with you, because I thought it was interesting thinking about neuroculture, particularly when you talk about like dematerialization and spiritualization. And I'm wondering just, what part of the human collective unconscious is trying to vacillate towards dematerialization in the world that we live in. And, I think just kind of having conversations with other creators and artists and friends who have never been spiritual or who have never had some sort of fundamental system of belief now vacillating towards that. Is that something that you can...
Do I don't speak about spiritualism, do I?
A
No?
little bit.
Do I?
You mention it.
Oh dear.
I'm wondering, is it just something you were possibly
I think
thinking
when we're talking
about?
about dematerialization, I think it's more in that kind of Deleuzian kind of way of getting away from territories and breaking down things. It very similar to one of the ideas in the book, particularly linking to neuroscience, is that people like Robert Zauck, who's a kind of an affect psychologist, Bruce Wexler, argue that the brain desires consonance. It wants to have balance, and one of the things I argue in there is, particularly in the case of the kind of the Trump constituent and the Brexit UKIP type of constituent, but what we need is more cognitive dissonance. Some sort of shock, some breakdown of those kind of belief systems that they have. So it's not really spiritualism; it's more kind of breaking
Sort
down,
of broader than
breaking
that,
down
yeah.
fixed kind of ideas.
Right.
There's a lot of romanticism around that kind of idea about deterritorialization, and I'm quite aware of the nonsense that can lead to. But I think probably in what I see in your work is an attempt to shake people out of ways of thinking. So that's where I was really at with that.
Yeah, more of a provocation. We really want to provoke people to think more deeply about not only the world we live in, but also about how we can make conversations around science, art, and technology more accessible. More than anything about saying something specific about the brain or how different regions of the brain are working, or saying that we're trying to target different regions of the brain, because that, if that's what you mean by territorializing different brain regions, we want to say, take a concept or an idea in neuroscience and translate it into a story so that it sticks more in your mind, more like your node-based learning, where if we say the neuron or a synapse and we tell you a story about it, then the next time you hear that word, you'll have that vision in your mind about what it is and how it functions.
Yeah. And also giving the agency, so having and embodying that character. We were working, when we were designing the piece itself, we were wondering if we should make this like a passive experience, but not knowing what the effects of virtual reality are, we wanted to experiment with the feeling of embodiment and ownership over the experience, and then also that kind of, as you were talking about, the psychedelic experience of losing your body, and how that also grounds the message, or it gives more meaning to the message, because at that point everyone, regardless of who is in the headset, is having the same experience, whether or not they identify with the individual that they're embodying or not.
Yeah, sure. Have you read Mexinger at all? No. Oh, right, okay. You should look into that, because that's talking about using neurotechnologies to kind of shock people out of fixed ways of thinking and turning the filters off. Another thing I was interested in case we've not got any questions, is when I read...
Don't everybody rush up at once.
When I read your interviews, I did a piece in another book about empathy, and particularly Obama's kind of mobilization of empathy. I can't remember which one of you it was, but made a really interesting comment about not liking empathy. And for me, it's kind of something that can be weaponized quite easily. There's a tendency to say, oh, wow, that's what we're going to do, is be in each other's shoes. But you made a fantastic point. I don't know if you recall it. But
yeah, we talk, in virtual reality, the more you hear people speak about their work and see VR as this empathy machine, we want to break with that sort of theory and thought, because if you're making a piece that is showing a hardship or something that a culture has had to go through, one specifically that isn't your own, who are you to put yourself in the position of being empathetic towards that situation without understanding what it's actually like to be there? So you have a headset on and you're theoretically present in that experience because the creator has made it so, and you can't really look anywhere else because you have a headset on. But we like to think of it more as being mindful of the story that we're telling you, and to let go of whatever preconceived notions that you may have and just look at the story and experience it as we intend for you to experience, and then come away with hopefully a new understanding and a new way to engage with groups that you see in the experience.
We do have some people lining up. Yes, please.
Hello. So I have a question. I guess it's primarily for Tony, but it might be relevant to the Hyphen-Labs as well. Since you're, and this is kind of associative, but since you're theorizing experiential capitalism, I was wondering if you've thought about dreams and the ways in which dreams are kind of summoned to sell products to people. I'm just very tuned into how the language of dreams appears in marketing, and in the little bits of commercial language that floats around. Because it seems like on one hand, dream might be this space outside of capitalism, but with the computational model of the brain, there's this almost lust to map dreams and dream space, and to figure out, how images are stored in the brain. So does a post-computational notion of the brain just totally destroy that project? And then my next question, which is kind of related, is about the ambivalent relationship of affect theory to psychoanalysis. And I thought you did a great overview of kind of debates in affect theory. And there's, frequently language that you would connect with psychoanalysis use, like this idea of the unconscious or the unthought, or something that's latent but still drives behavior. So I'm wondering if in some ways affect theory is returning to some psychoanalytic ideas, or if it's just completely rejecting it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. No, I hadn't really thought about dreams, but that's fascinating. One thing I've got that's kind of related to that is I work with the social theorist Gabriel Tard's work, and Tard identified the social kind of being as a sleepwalker, a somnambulist. So I'm really interested in that. But what I'm more interested in is sleep, maybe even dreams. There's some really interesting stuff by Matt Fuller on that. If you're looking for a non-phenomenological world, right, sleep is where to go, because it's where the self switches off. He talks about we might get some clues maybe through dreams, but in dream is just light sleep, isn't it? Once you're asleep, you're asleep. So I'm interested in that sense about what the non-conscious can be understood, how it can be understood through the idea of sleepwalking, which is, out, non-self, right, but walking and existing. So I was interested in looking at maybe things like social media use in that context.
Yeah, and interestingly, early technologies of movement, particularly early cinema, featured somnambulists quite often, and led to plays with doppelgangers and other sorts of things, so that the technologies allowed you to understand yourself in a fundamentally different way.
Jonathan Crairy's work.
Jonathan Crairy's book, yeah.
Yeah, I was also going to comment on that, where we do find ourselves in the sleep mode, though, with the constant influence of technology, where we're not ever really turning off at this moment. And while you're saying we can't necessarily disengage with our smartphones and our computers, how can we then turn off without and how can we turn off and not be in this sleep mode where we're always able to interact with each other and communicate, and how is that rewiring our conscious and then our subconscious as well?
Yeah. Can I come back to the Freud thing as well, the psychoanalysis? I can't remember the exact quote, but Deleuze says that Freud mistook the unconscious for daddy's voice. It really is the crowd, something like that. And that's where my kind of approach comes into it. I don't think there's a psychoanalytic unconscious. I think it's more of a way that we relate to each other and relate to our experiences. So I don't know if that helps, but...
Also, the language of dreams is not always glorious and wonderful and euphoric. It's often harrowing. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next question, please.
Thank you for those presentations. I'm thinking about the way over the past several decades there have been numerous theories that offer interpretations of the human subject that fragment the subject away from a kind of coherent subject position. So you've got like Deleuze and the individual, and then cybernetics proposes a kind of permeable boundary between subject and object, and so on and so forth. And Tony, I was thinking about your condensed but really good overview of academic and industry situated literatures on users and user experience design, and the way that user experience design almost needs to rehabilitate a static human subject that is homogeneous, complete, and also predictable. So in order to design virtual reality systems, for instance, like those of Hyphen-Labs, or technologies that require human interaction to be activated, there needs to be an element of certainty about the subject that that technology is being designed for and around. So user experience design almost needs to hypothesize or postulate a particular fixed image of the user before it can begin to craft the technologies that are responsive to or reactive to user intervention. So I'm just wondering, Tony, in your literary overview and in your critical practice as an academic, what critiques you would have to advance of the user in user experience design, and also maybe Hyphen-Labs. You talked a bit about the importance of including diverse representations within virtual reality as a kind of playable space, but how do you approach the process of designing an experience from the perspective of the user in user experience design, and how do you make that user open up to diverse possibilities beyond those that are already within the kind of industry literature around user experience? Thank you.
Sure, I can kind of jump into the last part of your question with including the user in the experience of design. So before we made our virtual reality piece of it, we had several workshops. We were part of a residency at New Inc. in New York. It's a tech incubator and accelerator affiliated with the New Museum. And we brought people in from our community who were Black women who are within the community that we were trying to speak to and design with. So it has to be a collaboration and a conversation rather than making something and then expecting that it will be helpful or useful to someone. And I think so often, you know, in our work, we want to bridge this gap between academia and community and praxis and execution. And in order to do that, there has to be a level of trust, and there has to be a constant evaluation and reevaluation and iteration. And we often don't get it right, but it's the intentionality of trying to do that I think that we're trying to get better at.
And I'd also add that we find so many, let's say, products that are marketed or that are offered to us have a kind of one-size-fits-all user definition. And what we're trying to do is get away from that a bit and make a hyper-specific experience for a specific user that potentially all types of people can enjoy, can learn from, can integrate some of the things that we're saying into their own experience, but not saying that something that is made for me will be great for you and great for everybody else in this room, because we all come from different places. So looking back into our own histories and our own cultures, our families, and our own personal experiences, then not to make hyper-personal work, but to make more interesting collective work.
Yeah, okay. So there's this sort of tension, isn't there, between the kind of consumer surveillance model, you know, the surveillance of intimate detail about particular users. But also, I think, on the other hand, there's this kind of, I mean, to repeat some of the kind of user experience curriculum, you know, it's not about the user, it's about the user experience. And you design for the experience, not the user. I've heard that said, you know, a few times. In a way, that's, to me, sort of, you know, I don't want to over-theorise this, but I probably will. It's kind of almost Whiteheadian. You know, we've got the kind of the whole idea of the, you know, the experience belonging to the individual as no, you know, it's experience is out there. You know, experience doesn't need to have a subject in the sense of a user subject. So I think that kind of churning and production of experiences, you know, the producing of experience, is in contrast to those kind of, you know, surveillance models of the user. So I'm starting to do some stuff with this sleepwalking thing around that, you know, but I couldn't really say much more than that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, so excellent. And this side of the hall has been carrying your weight, you know, for the Q&A. Just want you to know.
Somnambulists.
Thanks very much for the talk. I've noticed that in the fields of neuroengineering and BCI, there's a relative lack of critical and cultural awareness. And I was wondering if you could speak to sort of strategies for consciousness raising and bringing that sort of critical theory into the neuroscience lab, because I think if we don't do that, there will be disastrous consequences.
Well, okay. I mean, there's a, you know, the trend in the university at the moment is interdisciplinarity and kind of mixed methods and, you know, trying to get critical theorists in the same room as, say, HCI engineers and talking about those things. You know, if you talk to a lot of people involved in that, it's tough, you know, because it's almost like a different brain, you know, the engineer's brain and the critical theorist brain. But, you know, that's all you can do, and you can get in there and do it. I mean, you know, hopefully, that three paradigms thing that I was talking about, and that's an HCI text. So, you know, it's been picked up by a couple of HCI people, you know, just reference it as some piece of junk that they've read. But so it's gradually getting in that way. So, you know, interdisciplinarity seems one way of entering into those relationships with other disciplines where you might overcome some of the things you're talking about. But yeah.
I'd also add that a lot of the, I mean, at least a lot of the places that we were visiting that were in Silicon Valley were actually located within East Palo Alto, but it doesn't serve the communities in which they exist. And so it's so funny where it's like, where these large corporations are saying, you know, we want to raise culture and consciousness, yet they can't walk outside their front door. And invite people in, exactly. So and I think what we're really trying to do is figure out how can we collaborate with the community so that the community can also have a say in the direction that, you know, neuroculture goes in. And that's why we all wanted to start this project, was because we saw there were too many speculations of these like doomsday or these like, you know, rewriting memories or, and so we wanted to work on something that was completely different that was related to culture. So we started using social media to find, you know, people who were influencing culture and that were influencing us and reaching out to, you know, and talking to everybody, not feeling as if there were individuals that weren't worth, you know, our time because they didn't necessarily have the capacity to understand what we were talking about, because we have a really weird title to our project. But
I just wanted to add to that. It's also creating a platform. You know, sometimes companies or institutions don't have the infrastructure or the network to bring people in and speak to them and include them in the way that is necessary in order to set them up for success. But there are organizations that do that. Like in the US, there's like Black Girls Code or Women Who Code. You know, that is what they do, and they are that bridge, they're the glue that can make this work. But also, we often think a lot about, like, once people get into these institutions, if there isn't an infrastructure for support there, then, you know, they leave. We left because there wasn't that support, so we had to leave, build it for ourselves. And now that we have the platform for people to speak about their experiences and to also show what we are capable of, now it's time to go back and say, hey, this is the way that things could be different. And I think it takes a lot of work, but if there's a kind of mass movement towards doing that, we'll see a shift. There's no choice but for there to be a shift.
Great. So it's not so much necessary. I mean, the panel showed what can be done to a brain, what can a brain do, but more importantly, what can be done with a brain and how that makes us feel. And even though much of this is very futurist and speculative, I think we should think them in the traditional manner.